This episode of Color Code is brought to you by Mighty Boards. The best place to use reserved white is definitely going to be on the... Before we get into that, let's break this color down into neat little components. The color code today is SW7056, another Sherwin-Williams color by the name of Reserved White. Big thank you to Eileen for suggesting this color because I think it's definitely worth talking about. Breaking down the color to its core components, we start with its LRV of 74. The LRV, or light reflectance value, will tell you a lot about how light the color is, which is probably an important consideration when picking a color like reserved white. It has white in the name after all, so what is this 74 LRV telling us? The light reflectance value is a number which explains what percentage of light reflects off of the color, which tends to tell you how light the color is. 74 is light, but not white light. Just for comparison's sake, if we take a look at High Reflective White by Sherwin-Williams, it has an LRV of 93. So essentially we have a light color here that is advertising itself as being a white, when clearly it's an off-white. What makes it an off-white is the colorant that's inside it that's added to the original white tinting base, and what you get is more of a light gray color. So now that we know it's more of a reserved gray than a reserved white, what kind of gray is it? Although it's pretty subtle and unassuming at first, reserved white definitely shows a slight warm green undertone, and this is evident pretty much in all kinds of lighting. It does not have that same beige creaminess that other warm grays can sometimes have, which I sort of see as a good thing in this case. It's so clearly towards the cooler side of things that it won't give you the wrong impression and look beige under incandescent lighting. I know some of you are like myself and you just love to nerd out on those RGB values that you can find on the Sherwin-Williams website. And what you'll find is the red and the green components are perfectly balanced in this color, and then you have a reduced amount of blue. This is not a surefire way to analyze colors, as undertones, they can really manifest in very unpredictable ways. So you can't always just rely on the numbers themselves, especially when you're viewing it on a computer monitor, or even worse, your little smartphone. What you can do is take that information for what it is. And in this case, the reduction in blue makes sense visually to me. That's what gives the green and reserved white that touch of yellow warmth that prevents it from getting overly cold or blue leaning. What kinds of colors could I see working alongside reserved white? Like we discussed earlier, it's not your typical white paint color, and because of its light green nature, the natural pairing would be other grays. A color like Argos would suit it quite well, and that's because it's one of your down the middle cement or steel grays that don't look overly blue or overly beige. They just seem to be gray. Just be aware that with indoor lighting or direct sunlight, these down the middle grays will push over to cool territory a little bit, so just be aware of that. This darker gray will in turn make reserved white feel much closer to a white, because it's right next to that much darker, more visually apparent gray color. You could do the exact same thing in the opposite direction and make reserved white even more of a reserved gray by pairing it with a really nice warm white like white flour. This color has an LRV of 87, which is much brighter and would likely be a suitable trim color if you wanted a nice creamy look on your baseboards, trims, doors, moldings, whatever. But you can also make it a much brighter paired color on the walls nearby, and that'll help complement reserved white's more cool nature. I don't always like to go matchy-matchy with my paint colors. In fact, I rarely do. Although white flour could be a possible trim color option, it maybe wouldn't be my first choice for many people. I'd be much more inclined to recommend something like pure white, because it's still light enough to differentiate itself, but it has the warmth toned down a little bit, and it's a little more of a warm taupe undertone rather than a straight up beige creaminess. It's going to tie in a bit nicer and give your woodwork more of a delicate look, rather than an in-your-face type of feel. There is always that option of going with those mega bright white doors and baseboards, in which case you would just pick high reflective white, like we talked about earlier, and that'll ensure you get that dynamic, bright pop of white. But before you go ahead and assume that brighter is always better with your white paint colors, even when it comes to your trim, that isn't always the case. I've always been a big supporter of testing out your colors, and this case is no exception. If you're not familiar with Mighty Boards, it's an awesome paintable paint testing board that is large and in charge. I normally use it on walls so I can move it from room to room and really get a good idea of how the color will look like once I've painted it. I even use it for trim, where I actually paint the card and then I cut it into slightly smaller pieces to simulate how the baseboards would end up looking, or I can keep it in its large state and use it on a door. There's many things you can do with them. They're highly versatile, extremely useful, and you can check out our video detailing them in the description down below. Now for the all-important question: where or how should you use reserved white? Now, white colors tend to be utilized most often on things that are usually white. We're talking ceilings, molding, trim, and woodwork. Even though reserved white is a pleasant color that I really enjoy, I would see myself using it mostly on the walls, as a matter of fact. It takes enough of a dip in its LRV to stand firm on its own as a color. I think if you ended up using it on your trim and baseboards, it will read as a cooler gray rather than an off-white. This could absolutely be an intentional design choice, which could work pretty effectively, but I think for most people, it would be best to use as a wall color. And yes, I would even say that reserved white could be a main color that you can use throughout your entire home. Unless you were looking for a bright white, then look elsewhere. You can check out another Sherwin-Williams color right over here, another color code that has been cracked. See ya.